Okay, good afternoon everybody. This is a bit like a Great Program reunion, I think. I would like to welcome Pauline Gibbons, Dr. Pauline Gibbons, our honoured guest. Pauline, as you know, is an expert in language and literacy, in academic literacy, and especially in scaffolding and supporting students to master content, ESL students to master content, and ways in which the teacher can scaffold and guide them. You may be familiar with some of her books. Learning to Learn in a Second Language was, I think, your first one, was the first one that I read. Learning in the Challenge Zone, which is a more recent one. English Language Learners, Academic Literacy and Thinking, and Scaffolding Language, Scaffolding Learning. These have been, really important books to guide my professional practice and my understanding. So a big welcome, Pauline. We're really honoured to have you here. Thank you.
Do you mind if I sit down?
No, please.
Is that okay? I usually stand up to do these things, but it's kind of a round table and I feel a bit awkward about it. Well, I think I'm going to be preaching to the converted, because I thought possibly there would be people from the other faculties or the content areas, but as always happens, I've done a number of these in my own university. The people who come are the people who already have a language background, and the people who want to be there are not necessarily. So, if you think, I've heard all this, just tell me, and I'll modify it and do something else. But it might be a good opportunity for you also to give me some information, and also perhaps to, I hope it will affirm what you're doing at least. Okay, I wanted to start with a story about my own language learning. Many years ago, I lived in Tehran. It was when the Shah was still around, so it was about 1970, so it was a long time. It was one of my first teaching positions. And I bought myself a little book called Teach Yourself Persian. And this was page 37. I just want to show you how language teaching has changed for the better. So here is the first page of the book. It says, this translate and write. You have to do a lot of translation, both ways, and a lot of practicing of the writing. Now, I'm not saying these things are not useful, but I am saying that this is only the beginning of the course. This man is a thief. I came with my friend's horse. I saw the face of that man. This man's wife is not Iranian. I'm coming to Iran. So again, it's not exactly useful for me in that context, because that kind of teaching took no note at all of the notion of context. I call it the language in a vacuum approach, because what I wanted was to learn to go to the market to buy food and find my way around Tehran, and to ask directions, all of those things. But this was, I had to get to page 60 something before I had any useful vocabulary. So again, it's easy to knock old ideas, but this, as I said, the language in a vacuum approach, we are very far away from that now. And what I want to emphasize, drawing on the work of Professor Michael Halliday, is the notion of language in context. And it's a very good model of language if you're looking for ways of integrating language with subject learning. So why integrate language and content? Well, how we use language varies. And this was something that I think Michael Halliday was probably one of the first people to say this. This notion that language varies, it's not static. And it varies depending on the context in which it's used, which is why it's been so popular and so useful in Australia and to some extent the UK and parts of America, North America, and in South America as well, actually. Because if it varies, then it varies according to what you want to do with it. So it works very well to integrate it with subject learning. The choice of language we use in any context varies according to three variables. The field, which is what's being talked about. Now, that first example I started with, excuse me, didn't really have a field, because they were just separate sentences that had nothing to do with each other. So that was one point that, in terms of being a a useful model. It really wasn't. But this is, so what is being taught or written about? So science, economics, business, whatever area you're working in, education of course, the vocabulary usually defines the field. So if you look at the vocabulary, you can immediately see what a particular piece of text is about. It's also dependent on the tenor between the speakers or between the writer and the reader. There's a great deal of difference between saying to a group of students, would you mind handing me in your assignments as soon as possible, versus give them to me by the end of the day. Now the tenor has changed there, the field hasn't, but the tenor has. So the tenor is the relationship between the two speakers or two writers. So that varies according to all sorts of things, degrees of formality, it varies according to how you're feeling, how long you've known someone, and so on. But that's another way in which language varies. And the last one is the mode, whether the language is spoken or written, or somewhere in between. I want to stop briefly at this point and look more carefully at mode, because I think it's a very important area to think about when you're teaching academic language. So I'm going to show you something called the mode continuum, which shows you how spoken language and written language are on a continuum rather than being completely separate events. This came from a classroom that I was talking about yesterday, from a group of young primary students in science, and they were doing something. Now the point is that we have no idea what they were doing unless I tell you, because there is no specific vocabulary there. And in face-to-face dialogue, if you're intent on sharing something or doing something, you don't need much language actually. It's a really easy way in to English, because you've got words like this and that and these, and they're pointing words. But obviously if you couldn't see what people are doing, you have no idea what that is about. That's the, I call, most spoken that you can get, when you're actually in a situation and you're explaining to someone how to do something, or you're looking at something that's shared. What those students were actually doing was trying out magnets and finding out whether they were magnetic or non-magnetic. Various things were magnetic or non-magnetic. So they had a number of small items on their desk, and they had to find out which were magnetic and which were non-magnetic. Now this is one of the students telling the class what she learned. We tried a pin, a pencil sharpener, some iron filings and a piece of plastic. The magnet didn't attract the pin, but it did attract the pencil sharpener and the iron filings. The purple bits are the bits that weren't necessary in text 1. But once you start telling someone else about it, then obviously you need some vocabulary. In terms of child language development, children are often 2 or 3 years old before they can do that with any fluency. You probably all have, you've got children of your own, had very young children come back from kindergarten or daycare or whatever, and talk to you and you have no idea what you're talking about. My granddaughter a few years ago phoned me up and said, "Granny, I've got this," because she hadn't learned yet that if I can't see it, you need to name it. Now the implications for the classroom is that don't start, with young children, it's an ideal place to start like text 1, but then get them to talk about it in ways that pushes them towards written language. I call it literate spoken language because it's a little bit more like writing, that's the only reason. This is the 3rd text, and it's the same child who now writes, "Our experiment was to find out what a magnet attracted. We discovered that a magnet attracts some kinds of metal. It attracted the iron filings, but not the pin. It also did not attract things that were not metal." Notice the purple bits are getting bigger. This is a feature of academic language. We'll talk about that again in a moment. This came from a science textbook in secondary school, A magnet is a piece of metal surrounded by an invisible field of force which attracts any magnetic material within it. Magnetic attraction occurs only between ferrous metals. Now the field is the same, the tenor is different, and the mode is very different. So even though students can talk about something like in text 1, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be able to read or write it. However, I would argue very strongly for the value of spoken language like text 2 in the classroom, because it's a kind of way in to understanding more complex language. Just for comparison's sake, here is a text from a university text. My son gave it to me. He's a science teacher. That's why half my exam was in science. Some well-known ferromagnetic materials that exhibit easily detectable magnetic properties are nickel, iron, cobalt, gadolinium, and their alloys. Okay, so we've gone from the most spoken, if you like, to the most written, the most academic. And those purple bits, note, get bigger and bigger and bigger. And the reason for this is that in English, we code a lot of information around the nouns. All academic English does this. It probably happens in other languages too, but I'm only looking at English. So if you look at that last text, it's actually structurally a very simple sentence. It's A is B. It's just that the B, the A, is very, very long. It's got a lot of information in it. So it's some well-known magnetic materials, etc., etc., etc. That's all the subject, that's all a noun group. We call it a noun group or a nominal group. So the noun groups, the nominal groups get bigger and bigger as you get into more academic, usually when you get into more academic language. And the other things that happen is that the English plays around with the structure. So we've got something, where is it? In the early text 2, we've got the word attract. But when you are using academic language, when you're reading or writing, we tend to nominalize it and talk about attraction. But it actually comes from a verb. So we've kind of played around with the structure of the actual words, and those ION words often are the big ideas in an academic text. So things like, well, anything with ION on, in fact. So can anybody suggest any? Think of the ION words.
Education.
Education, from to educate.
Radiation.
Pardon?
Radiation.
Radiation, from to radiate. Think of some of the words that your students may have to learn.
Globalization.
Globalization. Any more?
Industrialization.
Industrialization. These are terribly difficult for second language learners. They're very difficult. When you show them the structure, look, it's really, go back to the verb. That's the meaning, but we're talking about it as a big idea now. It's not a verb anymore, it's a big idea, it's a concept. And many concept words are very much, are very likely to be these nominalizations. They don't always end in ION. They don't always end in ION, but many of them in English do. So the reason that, so text 5, if you were trying to read that without any background knowledge of the subject, you'd find that really, really difficult. So I think one of the things we can get from this is that we really shouldn't be giving students text to read until they have done the learning around it. I know at universities, and I used to do this myself, I used to give students, because I was teaching linguistics, I used to give students a text to read. And so we'll talk about it next lecture. And then I had a lot of international students, many of them from Southeast Asia. And they used to have a special lecture as well, because at those days we had a lot of money and we were able to support them properly. And so I taught these as well, in a small number, in a tutorial. And one of them said to me, you know, it'd be much easier if we had the text to read after the lecture. And I thought, what a terrific idea. So from then on, I changed the order, something as simple as that. So we talk about a linguistic idea, and then they would read the linguistics book. So we did it the other way around. And then a number of other students who were English speakers said, you know, this is much, much easier. So I think if we ask students to give them a reading before we talk about things, we're actually testing them. And many of them can't do it. So if you do it the other way around and give you a regular teaching task and then say, now you can read about it. Many, and they can't write about things either if they don't have that language. So I think something as simple as that, one of the major difficulties of reading in an academic context and writing is because of that need for those two things, nominalisation and very long nominal groups. I've colour-coded it so that you can see what I'm talking about. But if the colour coding wasn't there and you are a student with fairly limited English, trying to sort something out like that, you don't know where one chunk begins and another chunk starts. So I find the mode continuum very important. So field is important around the vocabulary, tenor is important in terms of relationship, but the mode I think is the most important. And it does impact greatly on speaking, on reading and writing. So then the choice of language we use in any context varies with the field, the tenor, and the mode. Does anybody, before I move on, does anyone want to ask any questions or ask for clarification? I've written about this in a number of places.
Sorry, I was going to say, when you gave the students the text after the lecture, did you follow up on the reading or do?
Yes.
Yeah.
Briefly the next lecture.
Okay.
But that meant we visited it twice, which was very helpful for them because they weren't reading in their first language.
Yeah.
And actually it helped the English speakers as well, because they weren't really used to reading it, academic linguistics texts either.
Yeah.
So it helps everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, so those are and that is the reason why the language in the vacuum model of language teaching is so different, and why I think this is so much more able to be integrated with academic reading and writing. There is another kind of culture that I haven't mentioned, so it's nothing to do with this. It's another example from something that happened to me, and it's to do with the culture, the broader culture. I don't mean the culture of academia, I mean the broader culture, the culture of the country, the culture of the people who you're teaching. And this was many, many years ago. I got a letter, and it was the politest letter I've ever had, asking for a copy of one of my books and asking me to send it, which is kind of unusual request. You know, you don't normally do that, but that was the first thing that made me think, this isn't an English speaker. And then I read the letter, and it is in perfect English. It's beautiful English, but not really appropriate. I am immensely delighted and profoundly honoured to send you this letter. Please accept my deepest esteem, my warmest, kindest regards, and sincerest wishes of constant happiness, good health, and ever-increasing prosperity and success in all your endeavours. It went on for 4 paragraphs. Deeply grateful to you for each second you have so graciously spent reading my letter. Please to accept, etc., etc., etc. Now, that's also a part of the culture. If I had written to that person using English, he or she would probably have thought I was extremely rude. So it works in reverse too. So if I'd said, you know, dear sir, or dear madam, or dear Mrs. or whatever, I've really enjoyed your book, and I'd wonder if you'd kindly send me a copy or something like that. It would be very brief in English. We don't muck around with things in English. It's very sort of brief. It would have been seen as being very ill-mannered, very bad manners. So these things, these cross-cultural issues are also an issue, but that's a separate talk, I think. But I didn't want to not look at that, because it is important, and it will affect your students' writing probably. So I want to talk at a very practical way of how you can think about integrating language and subject learning. I'm actually using a school example, not a university example, because I haven't got written up the examples that I've actually been involved with myself. But I did it in exactly the same way as what I'm going to show you now. I worked in a classroom where there was a science teacher. She was a very good science teacher, but she knew very little about language. She spoke very good English, but she hadn't studied linguistics. And she also, in the school, there was a second language teacher. So her job was to work with children who weren't fluent in English, which I have to say in Sydney is most of them. Many of our schools have 90% students who speak another language at home. Some of them have been born in Australia, but have grown up with two languages and not been particularly fluent in English. Others of them have arrived as migrants, or increasingly as refugees. So we have very high levels of second language learners in Sydney. And so teachers have to integrate language into everything they do. They have to, because the students haven't got time to go and learn English and then use it in school. And in any case, academic English, as we've seen, is different. So this was what the science teacher was going to do. She wanted students to develop an understanding of what constitutes an investigative method in science. Have you ever seen the Mythbusters videos? They're an American series, and it's a series that has been developed for non-scientists. It's for adults and young people. And what these scientists do is to take a myth, take something that people believe, but that's probably not true. And then they set up experiments to test that myth. So that the point of the video is to show people what makes a valid experiment. And the experiment they were looking at, and this was particularly for young people, these students that I'm talking about now were about 14 or 15. For this group of students, the myth was about wearing body jewellery. Okay, so there was a craze in Sydney, Australia, for students to start wearing a lot of nose rings and tongue studs and all sorts of piercings all over their face. And the particular video they watched was that if you have a tongue stud, that's one in your mouth, you are more likely to be struck by lightning. So it was a fun video. It wasn't meant to be as a serious one. What the video showed was that the scientists used 3 polystyrene heads. They used equal electricity, a volt of electricity towards each head. And what was the independent variable was the size of the metal. So two of the metals were one was very small, one was slightly bigger, and the other one was very big. The fact is there was no difference between them. They were all equally likely or equally unlikely to be struck by electricity. Now this really engaged the students. It really got them in because they thought it was fun. But it was quite a serious science unit, because what they did from that was learn how to set up a valid experiment. So I'll just go through what they did. In groups, they carried out independent investigations to prove or disprove common myths. So, for example, the heavier the object, the faster it falls, which is not true. So things like that. If you have toast and it's got butter on it, and you drop it, it will always land on the bottom side down. So they were fun things to do, but they had to take it seriously. They had to develop an experiment that would prove or disprove it. And at the end of the units, the students would present a written experimental report, which was an assessment task. Now, there was a lot of language in that the teachers could have chosen to use, a lot of language. And taking this into your contexts, similarly at university level, there would be a massive amount of language that you could integrate with anything that students are learning at university. The teachers, in fact, chose the last. They said, well, they're new to science, they don't yet know how to write an experimental report. So that will be our focus. So when they came to write the language objectives, they were quite brief. Writing an experimental report focusing on the overall structure, and that's really important. The genres or the text types of any culture are different. So as we saw from that letter, asking me for a copy of the book, genres, text types are cultural. So how you write in science is different from how you write in social studies, is different from how you write in economics, is different from how you write fiction. And each of these has a separate text type. It's actually, when you think about it, a very large learning load for students, especially if they're doing more than one subject. Okay, so what's that doing there? Sorry, it's not meant to be there. They chose to write an experimental report focusing on overall organisational structure, the shape of the, how you introduce it, how you describe the experiment, how you reflect on the experiment, how you evaluate the experiment, and what the results were. And they looked, first of all, then at the overall structure. They looked at appropriate academic language. Again, there was a lot of language in that, but what they've chosen to do was to look at the expression of cause and effect, because that was particularly important in science. It's also a very tricky subject for an area for second language learners. So as a result of this happened. This happened because of this. They also focused on the use of different time connectives because they had to describe the process of the experiment. So first, next, finally, those kinds of words. I'll come back to that later, but those linking words are very, very difficult for all second language learners because you only actually meet them in written language. So they're not something you can pick up through just being fluent in the spoken language. I don't know why I've done this twice. And then the appropriate science-specific vocabulary. They picked the keywords: control, dependent, independent variables, and replication. Notice there's a nominalization there, but they're going to actually replicate. They're actually going to do it, so that they will understand it. So there was a lot of objectives. That's what they chose to do. And the other reason they said is if this is an assessment task, we want to set students up for success. And they don't know how to do it. And we don't want the task to be a test on something they haven't done. I remember when I was at school, I'm sorry about all the anecdotes, I remember when I was in my final year of school, having to write a history essay. And when the teacher we were given no help at all about any of these things. When the teacher gave the history essays back, beautifully marked, she had put so much time into it, on all of them, very detailed things about what we should have done. And I remember thinking, why didn't you tell us that in the first place? Wouldn't that have been kind of easier, logical? So this is foregrounding the information that students will need. It's not testing whether or not they've got it. Okay, now the spoken language was a very important part of this. So when the teacher, before they actually did the experiment themselves, the teacher, this is just an example of the teacher talking about the video, but you can see how she's quite deliberately introducing some of the keywords that the students would need later. So she said to the students something like, what did the scientists do? And the students said they have to do it many times so that they can see if there are any changes. So notice the everyday language, many times. Yes, so they can see if they get similar results. And see if the myth is busted. It wasn't getting busted, but then they kept doing it until it got busted. The series is called Mythbusters. So they did the experiment many times. Your experimental method should be repeated a number of times too, so that a more accurate conclusion can be made. This is called replicating the experiment. Okay, so they repeated their experiment many times. They kept on doing it. They kept on doing it. And this is what you have to do as well in your experiments. You have to replicate the experiment. You're going to repeat it several times, replicate it. Why do we have to do that? So that we get more accurate results. So, replication is important when you design your experiments. Guess what word she wanted them to learn? Replication. But notice it wasn't given at the beginning of the unit of work. It wasn't, here are the vocabulary, we're going to define them, and this is the language you're going to need. It's very hard to do that, because you can only really understand the notion of replication when you've experienced it, when you've seen it, and then you can name it. So I'm not a great fan of teaching vocabulary ahead of a unit of work. I think it should be taught in a very integrated way, as she's done. It has to be teacher talk, the one on the right. It couldn't be anybody else. You'd never hear that conversation in any other context. Do you remember what I was saying about the mode continuum? What that conversation has done is, this is the language the students used, kept doing it, did it many times, and then the teacher said repeat. They knew the meaning of repeat. Replicated, so she's putting the two words together. They don't mean exactly the same, but it means they've got the idea of replication, of replicated. And then finally replication, which is the concept word from replicate, the nominalization. And so they learnt that key word, and therefore something about learning science, while they were actually watching videos and having conversations with the teacher. She did a lot of other things, but I don't have time to go into it. I won't talk about these. I will talk about how they taught writing. I'm focusing mainly on writing today, mostly because of time. There is a model of writing, a pedagogical model that we've developed in Australia called the writing cycle. Some of you may have been familiar with it. And it's a way that writing is taught, and we've used it in the academic units at university level too. When I was supervising PhD students, one of the things, of course, you have to do is to write a literature review. And for those students, it was a completely new way of writing. It was a new text type, a new genre. Of course it was, they'd never done it before. So we used a similar process with them, not quite as formal as this, but you have to show people how to do things. It's no good just telling them after the event, well, this wasn't what I wanted. So the first part of this cycle, and think of it as literally as a cycle, a circle, was building the field. Now in that science classroom, the field was the actual science that they were learning. So of course if you're integrating, the field is being developed not by the person who's involved with the language, but with the actual subject teacher. So that gets done, that usually gets done. Then a focus on the language of the text type. So how, in this case, how do we develop a science report? Or how do you write an economics essay? Or how do you write anything else in academia? And the aim of this, and this is where you people involved in language can be a great help to working with others. Becoming familiar with the purpose, the overall structure, the typical linking words, and the language of the particular text type. Do you know the proverb about the fish not recognizing the water in which it swims? No, I've not heard that. A goldfish does not recognize the water in which it swims because that's all it ever sees. So the water is very familiar to the fish. Now the same thing happens with subject teachers. They're so familiar with their own subject and so familiar with the ways of writing in their subject, they don't recognise that there's anything else out there. So they don't recognise the needs that the students may have, simply because they can do it, and it's very easy to think, well, this isn't difficult. Well, of course, it is difficult if you're from outside that fishbowl and you're looking at water for the first time. So when And this was something that the language person and the science person did together in the classroom. They co-planned it and they co-taught it. So the language teacher helped to do this part of it. So what the students did was they looked at a number of other language reports. They looked at how they all started, they looked at the linking words, the conjunctions, they looked at how they ended it, they looked at the language. In other words, they looked at lots and lots of examples. So that was part of the focus on the language of the text type. I've underlined linking words because I've noticed that this is something that students who are learning through English have a lot of problems with. So these are the sorts of things I mean when I'm talking about linking words. So indicating time. These are the words that often come at the beginning of paragraphs. Not always, but often. So they signal, they link, but they also signal what's going to come next. Indicating cause and effect. These were some of the words they got the children to use, the students to use in the science report. And they had to underline all the words they found with cause and effect. Adding information, sequencing ideas, comparing, contrasting, hope you can speed read, clarifying, and summarising. Those words I think that second language learners find difficult because they're not easy to see. You've really got to read things to hear those used, to see where these are used. We use them a bit in spoken language, of course, but not extensively. It's more within written literacy. So let me go back to the content. So we talked about that. The third stage, I don't know how possible this is to do in university. It does happen in classrooms, but I'm just not sure about this one. But it's where a teacher and a class write something together. Now, one of the things that the teacher knew was that they needed to know how to start a science report. And so if you can imagine a teacher playing the role of editor, not doing it for the students, but playing the role of an editor, she would say things like, remember all those texts we looked at? Who remembers how we might start with our piece of writing? And she wrote it up, they're actually using whiteboards. She wrote it up based on the suggestions that the students gave her. So they would make a suggestion, she'd write it up, she'd read it, and she says, anybody got another way, a better way of doing this? So they'd write another way of starting. And they'd cross out if there were mistakes, and they would change things, and together they wrote that first paragraph. Now, it not only shows the product, the kind of writing that they have to do, it also shows the process of writing. And good writers don't write something just once. They write it, they rewrite it, they reread it, they cross out. It's much harder to do with well, it's easier to do with computers, but the problem for the teacher is that they don't see any of the back drafts. My feeling, and I might be my fraction of my age, my feeling is that it's a lot of students now, certainly at school, and actually also at university, don't proofread as well on screen as they might do on hard copy. Now, I've got no evidence of that, except that some of the essays I've read and some of even the PhD things are full of small errors. There's something about proofing. So this is to show them both what the model is, what sort of writing they should do, plus looking at things like the process of writing. And finally, independent writing. Now that used to be what we used as a writing cycle. I've added to it because more and more I think it's important for students to reflect on and edit their own work. You've given them a lot of help if you've gone through something like this. There comes a point where you hand over to the student. So I've added a stage where for students to become mindful and autonomous learners. I will show you an example of something I use with students to help them to do this. But I think there comes a point where the scaffolding the teacher has to step back and hand over to the student. I just wanted to show you a couple of other things though. Again, this is a school text for years 12, which is the final year of school in Australia. And we had a newly arrived student who'd only been in the country about 6 months, and he spoke Arabic and a little bit of English. And the classroom had been talking about climate change, and because we have some fairly strange comments in newspapers sometimes, and an American president is very good at this, saying it doesn't exist, right? So they had to write a discussion arguing for or arguing against the fact of climate change happening, and they were doing this in science as well. But this student, so this what this is a way to help that one student who was just new to English. He was very clever, was very well educated, and it shows them the shape. In this case, not of a science report, but a discussion. So say what this discussion is about, give your opinion, give your reasons for your opinion, other people's reasons, give your conclusions. And there were sentence starters, because often for students who are really struggling, what they struggle with is getting started. So I gave him some of the sentence starters that he could use. And he did a pretty good discussion. Now, it wasn't up to the standard of the others, but he did it. And I think the whole point about scaffolding is that you don't have to scaffold in the same way for every student. There will be some students who can do the task straight away. There will be others who are sort of somewhere in the middle, and there will be some that will struggle. So if you want to, do you use the word differentiation in here? If you want to differentiate the curriculum, one way to do it is to differentiate the tasks. And I don't agree with that, because I think everyone should be aiming high. But what I do think is that you differentiate them for the kind of support that you give different students or groups of students. Now, there's always a lot of resistance to this, because people say, well, that's cheating. These students get more help than others. I don't see it as that at all. I see it as building up for success. You can't do that when they have exams, obviously, but you can prepare them for things like that by giving some students more help than others. I don't personally have a problem, but that's my philosophy of education. So that was for a student then who had gone through the writing cycle, not to do, of course, with writing science reports, but that was another example. But I said earlier something about having students reflect on their own work after they finished. So this is a reflection sheet. Again, it was for writing an argument. So an argument is when you're just showing one side of a case. Okay, so you believe something and you have a number of arguments. So you can imagine the teacher's gone through the whole of that cycle I was talking to you about, and then the students are going to write. This is for the student to self-edit. So, has a friend read your work? Did they understand your ideas? I like students to share their work. Have you organised your ideas well? Have you written an introduction? Have you written several arguments? Have you included details to support each argument? Have you written a conclusion and a recommendation? What signalling words? They were the linking words I was talking about earlier. Sometimes I say signalling, sometimes I say linking. What linking words did you use to introduce each new argument? And there's a subtext here, which is, did you use any linking words to introduce arguments? Okay, so you could vary this in any way you liked, but I do think all students need some kind of checklist, specifically looking at the language of what it is that they're supposed to be writing. Okay, I just want to finish with something to do with reading, because I would argue the same process for teaching and reading. I didn't have time to talk about reading today. in that you set students up to read successfully. You don't give them something to read that they are going to have to struggle with. I mean, they can struggle a little bit, a bit of struggle's okay, but not something that's so difficult that they're having to look up every word. And as I said earlier, I think that I learned a lot from my foreign overseas students who asked for the reading to come after the class. And it was such a simple thing to do. But I want to finish on a note of humour. I got this from, I should go back a step. My books are published in America mostly, so I have to pay American tax, right? So I used to get, they don't send it to me now, but I used to get this long tax form to fill in for American tax office. The first question was, what is your name? Okay, you'd think that was simple, wouldn't you? And then they also sent me a kind of list of instructions about how to fill in each question. So it was supposed to help me to understand the question, right? Explanatory leaflet. So here's the first question, what is your name? I thought, well, I can do that, but I better have a look at the explanatory leaflet. This is what I promise you, this is authentic. Enter your name if you are a disregarded entity. Can you read it from the back?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just let you read it.
Does it sound familiar?
I have no idea what that means.
Oh my God.
So this was to help me fill in the questions. What is your name?
I don't.
Now that's why I'm suggesting you don't give students a piece of text that you haven't yet talked about. It's not completely talked about everything, because if you did that, there's no point in reading it. But giving them enough hooks, cognitive hooks, so that they can actually understand what they're reading. And I still don't understand it. So I just filled in my name. And I was very tempted to have a t-shirt made that I am a disregarded entity. We're a bit serious when we went to America now, so I thought I'd better not do that. Okay, so you can see the link between reading and writing. I'm sorry I haven't had time to talk about writing, reading. So what I've been really talking about is functional linguistics. It's a model of language that enables you to look not just at sentence grammar, but at whole texts, and looking at the impact of what those contextual features are on the language itself. This is Michael Halliday. Halliday's systemic functional linguistics is a functional theory of language that has at its heart the notion that language varies according to the purpose for which it's used and the social context in which it occurs. So that's summing up. I've given you the reading bit at the end, notice? So we just talked about that, and now I've given you the definition. But given you that at the beginning, you probably wouldn't have understood it. Now you should understand it perfectly. So these are the two of the books that were mentioned earlier. That this one is an older one, but it's just updated it, so it's got a new edition. And that one is for slightly older learners, but I think they are able to be used actually at all levels, including university levels. So thank you very much for listening. Does anyone would like to ask a question? I'm conscious that I only have an hour.
No questions?
Is that because you haven't understood anything I've said, or because
I think everything was very clear. So people probably have classes and meetings to go to, as Pauline has
and I
places to
appreciate
go
the
as
time
well.
you've taken to come here, so it's lovely to see you.
Thank you so much. It was really very, very clear and very structured. Thank you so much. And a big thank you to Dr. Anna Dillon from the College of Education and the ECLC for organising and getting
There's a lot of
Pauline
organising
here.
around
Yes,
that.
I know, I can imagine so. Okay, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for coming. Have a good rest of the day.